Ladies and gentlemen, when we think of betrayal, our focus is naturally drawn to the one who has been betrayed, the person who is left questioning their worth, picking up emotional shards, trying to understand how someone they trusted could turn against them. But what's less examined and often completely overlooked is what happens within the betrayer, especially when that betrayer is a narcissist. There's a common belief that narcissists are immune to guilt, that they simply move on, unaffected, cold and calculated. But the reality, while not necessarily sympathetic, is far more complicated and in many ways more tragic. When a narcissist betrays someone, especially someone close to them, they do more than violate a relationship. They initiate a kind of psychic implosion within themselves. See, narcissists don't have a grounded sense of self that can endure contradiction or failure. Their identity is a fragile construction built not on inner substance but on outward affirmation. Their self-worth is constantly being propped up by admiration, control, and the illusion of perfection. When they betray someone, especially someone who once idealized or trusted them, they destroy one of the mirrors that reflected their ideal self back to them. And they feel that loss, even if they can't admit it. At the moment of betrayal, they may feel powerful, they may feel justified, but beneath that flash of superiority is something more sinister, the beginning of fragmentation. They've broken something sacred, something that once affirmed their worth, their importance, their fantasy of being loved without conditions, and that breach triggers a kind of silent collapse. It's not the collapse of conscience in the conventional sense, but something deeper. A destabilization of the narrative they've told themselves about who they are. This is why betrayal harms the betrayer, particularly the narcissist, in ways that aren't always visible. It's not immediate remorse necessarily. It's not the kind of guilt that shows up with tears and apologies. No, it's quieter, more corrosive. It shows up in restless nights, in disproportionate anger, in the need to reframe the story so they can avoid looking in the mirror too long, because deep down they know. They've betrayed not just you, but the very part of themselves that wanted to be loved, admired, and seen as good. And that realization, even if only half consciousness, begins to eat away at them. What's important to understand is that narcissists are not free from internal conflict. They're just experts at avoiding it. But avoidance isn't the same as resolution, it's repression. And repression has a cost. Over time, the weight of their betrayals builds up like emotional debt. And because they refuse to acknowledge it openly, it starts leaking out in other ways. Failed relationships, self-sabotage, isolation, the inability to form real intimacy, all symptoms of an internal world slowly caving in. Now, this doesn't mean they become better people because of it. Pain doesn't always lead to transformation, but it does lead to suffering. And while it might not be visible, it's very real. They carry it in their silence, in their moments alone, in their constant need to chase new validation, to silence the ghosts of the ones they pushed away. And no amount of external success or charm can truly silence that inner chaos. This is the cruel paradox of narcissistic betrayal. In trying to preserve their inflated sense of self, they destroy the very things that gave it meaning. In manipulating and betraying someone who loved them, they damage one of their last remaining links to genuine connection. And whether they can admit it or not, they feel that absence. They feel it when the room is quiet, when no one's texting back, when they're surrounded by people and still feel hollow, that emptiness, that cold space inside them. That's the price of betrayal. And here's the deeper layer. They often don't even know why they feel so disconnected, so restless. They blame others. They rewrite history. They convince themselves you were the problem, that you were too needy, too demanding, too emotional, anything to keep from facing the truth that they created their own loneliness, that they turned away from the one person who offered them something real. And once real is gone, it's not so easy to replace, because all the flattery in the world doesn't feel like love. All the admiration fades, all the applause stops eventually. That's when the silent pain becomes inescapable. They may try to numb it with distractions, with attention, with rebound relationships, but it follows them because it isn't about you anymore. It's about what they lost within themselves by hurting you, that part of them that wanted to be good, to be valued, to be seen as worthy of love. It withers, and they're left chasing a version of themselves that no longer exists, or worse, realizing they were never that person to begin with. It's not a morality tale. It's not about punishment. It's about consequences, internal, psychological, spiritual consequences. And narcissists, for all their armor and arrogance, are not exempt from those. They may not speak the language of accountability, but they live in the aftermath of their actions. And that aftermath is loud in its silence. It's there in their inability to form new attachments, in their endless need for approval, in the fear that someone might truly see them, not the performance, but the brokenness behind it. So when we say that betrayal harms the betrayer, it's not an abstract concept, it's not poetic justice, it's a psychological reality. For the narcissist, betrayal is a kind of self-sabotage. It's a wound inflicted inward, even if the blade was meant for someone else. And that wound never quite heals, because they never allow it to. They'd rather cover it with pride than tend to it with humility. But pride is a poor bandage, and eventually the pain bleeds through. That's the silent tragedy. Not just that they hurt you, but that in doing so, they condemn themselves to a life of chasing shadows, of living in a hall of mirrors, never quite finding the reflection they're looking for, because they shattered it the moment they betrayed the person who saw them clearly. And that kind of damage, it doesn't go away. It just hides quietly, permanently. The image of the narcissist, self-assured, emotionally detached, always in control, is an illusion carefully crafted and painstakingly maintained. It's a mask, not a mirror. And what lies behind that mask is not confidence, but fear. Not invulnerability, but vulnerability in its most disfigured form. Narcissists feel pain. They feel it deeply. But it's not pain they know how to process or even acknowledge. It's silent, hidden, and it manifests in ways that are often invisible to the outside world. This pain is not what you'd see in a person who has truly reckoned with what they've done. It isn't the open, redemptive sorrow of someone who's ready to make things right. It's something more like internal collapse, quiet, constant, and corrosive. When a narcissist betrays someone, especially someone who trusted them, they don't simply walk away unscathed, even if they act like they have. What they do is suppress. They push the discomfort down so deeply that it becomes a part of the very structure they stand on, a fault line running through the foundations of their identity. At the surface, they may appear indifferent. You might see them posturing, dismissing, laughing, or even moving on to someone else with lightning speed. But that performance is just that, a performance, a desperate attempt to outrun something that gnaws at them from the inside. That something is a dissonance they cannot resolve. Because on some level, even if it's buried under layers of self-deception, they know they've done harm, and knowing that doesn't align with the image they cling to, the image of being superior, untouchable, justified in everything they do. To admit that they've hurt someone who cared for them would be to admit a fundamental flaw in themselves. And for the narcissist, that kind of self-awareness is intolerable. Their entire psychological survival depends on not seeing themselves as weak, wrong, or flawed. So instead of admitting that they caused pain, they go silent, not outwardly, but inwardly. They cut themselves off from that awareness. But what is repressed is not erased. It lingers, it festers, and it distorts everything that comes after. Their pain becomes like a background noise they can't shut off, no matter how loud they turn up everything else. It's in their inability to sit still, in their need to keep moving from person to person, distraction to distraction. It's in their agitation when left alone, when no one is watching, when the silence sets in, and it's in that silence that their pain becomes undeniable. That's where the mask slips, when no one's around to applaud, when there's no one left to charm or manipulate. This kind of pain is particularly cruel because it's self-inflicted, yet never acknowledged. It's the pain of losing something they didn't realize they valued until it was gone, something they pushed away while clinging to their inflated self-image. They don't cry over it, not in ways you might recognize. Instead, they experience it as boredom, emptiness, restlessness, or even rage. They may lash out at others or at themselves without really understanding why. But the reason is always the same. They betrayed someone who saw them, who valued them, who offered them something real. And in doing so, they betrayed their own capacity for connection. There's no peace in that, no satisfaction. Because every time they try to recreate that connection, they're haunted by the fact that they can't. Not because it isn't available in the world, but because they've made themselves incapable of receiving it. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires truth. And those are precisely the things the narcissist fears the most. Their pain comes from this constant tension, wanting to be loved, but being too afraid of being known, wanting closeness, but building walls, the moment someone gets too near. The more they betray others, the more isolated they become. But they won't call it isolation. They'll call it independence. They'll call it strength. They'll convince themselves that they're better off alone, that they don't need anyone. But that's the voice of pain, talking, quiet, muffled, but relentless. It shows up when they lie awake at night, scrolling through memories they'll never admit meant anything. It shows up when they see someone new falling for them and they already know how it will end. It shows up when they pretend they don't care and then can't explain the ache that follows them around like a shadow. This isn't to say that narcissists are victims. Their actions have real consequences, and the people they hurt carry those wounds long after the narcissist has walked away. But to understand their silent pain is not to excuse it. It's to recognize the complexity of the human psyche, even in those who seem least capable of introspection. Because pain denied is pain multiplied. And when narcissists deny their inner wounds, they don't just hurt others, they poison themselves. They live in a kind of perpetual exile. From others, yes, but more painfully from themselves. They can't access the parts of them that feel guilt or sorrow or remorse because those parts threaten the identity they've constructed. But the cost of that disconnection is high. It's the loss of authenticity, the loss of peace, the inability to feel safe even in their own skin. You might wonder, do they ever regret? Do they ever miss you? The answer is complicated. They may not miss you in the way you deserve to be missed, not as a person with depth and value, but they miss the version of themselves they were able to be when you were around. The reflection you offered, the meaning you gave to their story. When that's gone, a hole opens up. They'll try to fill it with something, anything, but nothing fits because nothing is real anymore. And that's where the pain lives, in the space between who they are and who they pretend to be. So no, the narcissist might never tell you they're sorry. They may never acknowledge what they lost, but their silence is not absence of feeling. It's a cage, a suffocating self-imposed cage built from fear, pride, and shame. And inside that cage, they carry the weight of every betrayal they've committed, not because they choose to, but because somewhere beneath all the defenses they know. They know what they've done, they know who they've lost, and they know in the quiet moments they can't escape that they are the reason for their own suffering. Pain has the potential to be transformative. It can awaken us, humble us, and invite us to look at ourselves honestly. In many people, guilt becomes a doorway, a difficult but essential passage toward healing, accountability, and change. But for the narcissist, that door is almost always locked. Their pain doesn't lead them to redemption. It doesn't soften them or strip them of pretense. Instead, it calcifies. It buries itself deep beneath layers of denial, blame, and self-deception, becoming something toxic and immobilizing. And that's what makes the narcissist's pain so tragically unique. It rarely, if ever, becomes a catalyst for growth. To understand why, we need to look at how the narcissist processes guilt, if they process it at all. In a healthy person, guilt signals a moral transgression. It tells you that you've done something that conflicts with your values, your empathy, or your sense of right and wrong. It compels you to reflect, to feel discomfort, and hopefully to take steps to repair the damage. But in a narcissist, the emotional system is wired differently, not because they don't feel guilt at all, but because admitting guilt threatens the fragile scaffolding of their identity. For the narcissist, being wrong is intolerable, not just unpleasant, but existentially threatening. Their self-pitch is constructed around the need to be superior, to be infallible, to be admired. Admitting a serious wrongdoing, like betrayal, would mean acknowledging a deep flaw, and this would rupture the narrative they've built to survive. So instead of confronting the guilt directly, they sidestep it. They distort the truth, they rationalize, they minimize, they project, they tell themselves stories that paint you as overly sensitive, unreasonable, or even deserving of the betrayal. In doing this, they relieve themselves temporarily of conscious responsibility, but at a cost. That unprocessed guilt doesn't vanish. It mutates into other forms of pain, bitterness, paranoia, chronic dissatisfaction, and emotional detachment. What makes this worse is that the narcissist often believes their own narrative. Their defense mechanisms are so robust, so thoroughly ingrained, that they can deceive themselves as easily as they deceive others. They convince themselves they did what they had to do, that they were provoked, mistreated, undervalued. It's always someone else's fault. And in doing so, they dodge the emotional labor that real guilt demands. This avoidance is not without consequence. Every time a narcissist betrays someone and refuses to confront the truth, they drift further from their authentic self, and authenticity is essential to healing. You cannot become whole if you won't face the parts of yourself that are broken. You cannot make peace with others if you refuse to acknowledge how you've harmed them. But the narcissist won't or can't engage in that kind of self-examination. It requires a level of humility they've spent a lifetime avoiding. It requires vulnerability, and for them, vulnerability feels like death. As a result, their pain festers. They don't grow from it, they grow around it, like a tree growing around a rusted nail. The injury becomes a permanent fixture, distorting every future relationship, every future decision. They become more guarded, more manipulative, more desperate to maintain control. They learn nothing from the suffering they cause or endure, because to learn would require admitting that they had something to learn in the first place. This is one of the great ironies of narcissistic pain. It is both self-inflicted and self-perpetuating. They cause their own suffering by betraying others, then refuse to acknowledge that suffering honestly. They build an entire emotional life around avoidance and then wonder why they feel empty, anxious, and alone. They repeat the same patterns, chasing new sources of validation, new people to mirror back an idealized image of themselves, never realizing that the problem is not out there, it's in them. But without the ability to reflect inwardly with honesty, they are trapped in a cycle of pain that masquerades as strength. What's especially tragic is that this pain could be transformative if the narcissist were able to drop the mask even for a moment and face the raw truth of what they've done, how they've hurt others, and how that harm reflects something wounded in themselves. They might begin to change. They might find the humility needed to apologize, to make amends, to rebuild something real. But that kind of reckoning requires courage they rarely possess. It's much easier to double down on the lie than to confront the truth. And so they remain stuck. Their relationships suffer, their inner world becomes more chaotic, the moments of triumph feel less satisfying, no success can soothe the ache of unresolved guilt, no applause can drown out the whisper that they've burned bridges that mattered, and the more they try to fill that void with superficial comforts, the deeper it becomes. This is the prison they create, a beautiful facade built around a hollow center, and no one can save them from it until they're willing to face the truth themselves. Pain has a purpose. It can guide us toward better choices, toward compassion, toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. But only if we listen to it, only if we respect it. Narcissists don't do this. They silence pain. They cover it in rage or indifference or charm. But pain that is silenced does not disappear. It festers in the dark. It warps everything it touches. And without the humility to confront it, it becomes a permanent feature of the narcissist's emotional life. They may appear to move on, they may start new relationships, gain new followers, accumulate more surface-level praise, but nothing changes because inside they're still carrying that unacknowledged wound. They're still haunted by the person they betrayed, and more importantly, by the version of themselves they destroyed in the process. That version, the one capable of intimacy, of truth, of love, is buried beneath years of defense mechanisms and pride. And until they unearth it, until they sit with their pain long enough to learn from it, they will never be free. Their suffering is not loud. It doesn't look like remorse in the traditional sense, but it's real. It's the ache they feel in quiet moments, the discontent that follows them despite their achievements, the emotional numbness that creeps in after every betrayal. It's a life haunted by unfinished emotional business, by guilt that never found its voice, by pain that never had the chance to become something meaningful. That is the cost of refusing redemption, not eternal damnation in some abstract moral sense, but a very real, very human kind of loneliness, the kind that comes not from being abandoned, but from abandoning your own soul. There's a particularly haunting form of grief that narcissists often endure in the wake of betrayal, not necessarily the loss of the person they betrayed, but the loss of the ideal self they imagine themselves to be. It's a silent internal mourning that is almost never expressed aloud. Unlike most people who feel guilt or regret because of how their actions hurt others, the narcissist feels an aching void because their behavior has ruptured the carefully crafted version of themselves they once believed in. They mourn not just the relationship, but the narrative. And that narrative was everything. The narcissist's self-concept isn't rooted in reality. It's not stable or secure or based on a solid understanding of who they are in all their complexity. Instead, it's a fragile ideal, a fantasy built on admiration, control, power, and the illusion of flawlessness. It's how they survive. The ideal self is charming, irresistible, righteous, generous, and always justified. It's the version of themselves they project into the world and try desperately to believe is real. Every relationship, especially those that involve deep emotional investment, plays a part in reflecting and reinforcing that fantasy. But when they betray someone who loved them, someone who truly saw them, they can no longer uphold that illusion without cracks. The act of betrayal doesn't just fracture the bond with the other person, it shatters the mirror that reflected their idealized image back to them. In your eyes, they were someone good, someone worthy, someone admired. When they hurt you, they destroy not just the connection, but the version of themselves that only existed in that relationship. And that loss is devastating to them in a way they often don't have the words or the courage to articulate. The narcissist doesn't process this grief in a healthy or visible way. They don't cry in your arms, confess their sorrow, or go on a journey of inner healing. Instead, they internalize the fracture and then spend enormous amounts of energy trying to restore the ideal image, often by rewriting history. They'll tell themselves that you were weak, too emotional, manipulative, or flawed, anything to shift the blame, because accepting responsibility would mean accepting that they are not the person they claim to be. But even as they project those justifications outward, a deeper part of them knows what they've done, and that knowledge never fully disappears. This inner conflict creates a painful dissonance. They may appear to move on, find someone new, or even thrive on the surface, but underneath it all is a gnawing sense of failure, an emotional undercurrent of shame and inadequacy. The new relationship won't fix it. The praise they seek from others won't fix it, because what they truly mourn is the lost possibility of being the version of themselves they tried so hard to become. The betrayal became a betrayal of self as much as it was a betrayal of the other. And here's the irony. The idealistic ideal self they clung to was never based on authenticity. It was based on image, on perception, on control. But that doesn't mean it didn't feel real to them. In fact, it may have felt like the only version of themselves they could love. When that version is shattered by their own behavior, they are left emotionally displaced. They don't know who they are anymore. They don't have a grounded sense of self to fall back on. So they float, disconnected, unanchored, and perpetually seeking a reflection that can restore what was lost. In this sense, their mourning is different from ordinary sorrow. It's not just emotional, it's existential. The betrayal creates a fracture in the story they tell themselves about who they are. And rather than examine that fracture and try to heal, they often double down on illusion. They build a new narrative, find someone new to validate them, or bury themselves in distraction. But deep down, they know they're only performing. They know that the version of themselves they're trying to present is not aligned with who they truly are, and that gap creates a sense of inner emptiness that follows them everywhere. That emptiness is particularly cruel because it has no clear source they're willing to acknowledge. They can't say, I miss who I was when you looked at me with love. They can't say, I destroyed something sacred because I was afraid of being seen. So instead, they live with a kind of phantom pain, a grief that has no name, a longing that has no direction. It's the ache of potential wasted, of truth denied, of authenticity forfeited. And it doesn't go away no matter how many masks they wear. This silent mourning bleeds into every aspect of their life. It shows up in their inability to sustain long-term joy. It's in their restlessness, their boredom, their cycles of self-sabotage. It's in the way they look for new people to impress, new situations to control, always hoping that something or someone will give them back the sense of wholeness they once had before they betrayed it. But the more they chase, the more distant that ideal self becomes, because it was never rooted in truth, and truth is the only thing that can endure. Even if they don't articulate it, the narcissist feels this loss. It's the reason they remember you long after you've moved on. It's why they revisit conversations in their mind, even if they pretend you never mattered. They aren't haunted by you as a person, they're haunted by who they were when they were with you, or more accurately, who they believed they were. Because when someone sees you, truly sees you, and still chooses to love you, it gives you access to a kind of emotional wholeness that's otherwise unattainable. And when you destroy that, you destroy access to a version of yourself that felt, even if briefly, almost real. And what replaces that? For the narcissist, not much, just more illusion, more denial. more attempts to control the narrative, the people, the environment, anything to escape the reality that they are not who they wanted to be. Their mourning becomes chronic, lifelong. They may never fully understand it. They may never confess it, but they live with it every day. It shapes how they see others, how they treat themselves, and how they interpret the world. This isn't about pity. It's about understanding the full cost of betrayal, not just to the one who is betrayed, but to the one who betrays, especially when that person's entire identity is built on illusion. Because when the illusion breaks and they're left with only themselves, they realize, often too late, that the self they lost may have been the closest they ever came to being whole. That is the silent pain they carry, the mourning of a self they destroyed with their own hands. And no one, not validation, not a new partner, not success, can bring that version back, because it only existed in the presence of truth. And the moment they chose betrayal, they chose to live without it.